I'd like to thank Sofiane and the conference organizers. It's a pleasure to be here. The ongoing Syrian war has exacted a tremendous toll on the country's civilian population. Among those civilians are Palestinian refugees who numbered about 560,000 prior to the war. Over 2/3 of them were internally displaced, and at least 20% have fled Syria. 95% of those who are still in Syria are receiving sustained humanitarian assistance from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA. Those who have attempted to flee across Syria's borders to other countries in the region have generally not been welcomed by host governments. They have faced closed or tightening borders, forcing a significant number of them to enter neighboring countries clandestinely. And upon entrance, they generally live under a precarious legal status. An increasing number of them have continued on to Europe. So in this presentation, I focus on the effects of the Syrian war on the Palestinians of Syria, including their displacement across Syrian borders. First, I give an overview of the situation of Palestinians inside Syria. Then I talk a little bit about those who have left Syria, fled Syria, once again becoming refugees. And while much of the presentation analyzes the response of governmental actors and intergovernmental agencies to the plight of Syria's Palestinian refugees, I end by shedding light on actions taken by Palestinian refugees themselves to address the devastating effects of the Syrian war. So Palestinians in Syria. Similarly to their Syrian counterparts, Palestinians in Syria have been severely affected by the ongoing conflict. Syrian towns and villages, as well as Palestinian refugee camps, have been subject to repeated attacks and prolonged sieges by troops loyal to the Assad regime and by Syrian rebels. And here's a map of Syria with the different Palestinian refugee camps. Some of the camps that have been the most affected are in the Damascus area, so camps like, and they're, it zooms in right here in the square here. So camps like Deraa, Sbeine, Khaneshie, Yarmouk, Husseiniye have suffered significant shelling, destruction, and the massive displacement of their population. And then up north, this camp Ain Natal here has also, basically in 2013, was basically rebels came in and declared the camp a military zone and expelled the camp's entire population. And today the camp lies in ruins, basically because of fighting due to repeated efforts by the Syrian government to reclaim it. And then if you look at the camps in the sort of Damascus, greater Damascus area, right now Khaneshie is one of the most affected. It's been caught in heavy fighting that has basically sealed it off from its surrounding areas and basically made it almost impossible for humanitarian aid to get through. And then Deraa camp is another one that was completely depopulated. Some of the Palestinians have been able to come back to the area, around the city of Deraa, but some of those neighborhoods also, like Muzayrib and Jilin, have been affected by or caught in heavy fighting and again, kind of sealing off the population from its surroundings. And then Yarmouk camp, located at the southern tip of Damascus, is in the third year of a siege that has been particularly prolonged and has had a devastating effect on civilians and has caused a significant amount of deaths from starvation, approximately 200 as of now. As of January 2016, more than 3,000 Palestinians have been killed, 1,048 are being detained, and 282 are missing. The majority of detainees are in Syrian government prisons, but some are also being detained by various rebel factions. UNRWA, the main humanitarian organization that is assisting Palestinian refugees affected by the war in Syria, was created in 1949 in response to the Palestinian refugee crisis stemming from the Arab-Israeli conflict in 1948. Thus, it had already been operating in Syria for over 6 decades when the uprisings and subsequent war started about 5 years ago. Before the war, it was mostly providing education and basic social services to Syria's Palestinian refugees. It was also engaged in infrastructure and socioeconomic development in some of the camps. And here, also just to kind of give you an idea of what these camps were like before the war, this is Ain Tel, which is now basically in ruins. And also to pick up on some of what Julie was talking about. So within the last decade, UNRWA has undergone this shift in policy where it's actually trying to engage with Palestinian refugees through a much more developmental kind of approach, and trying to introduce urban development within the realm of the refugee camps. And actually, Ain Tel and another camp, Nadab, also up north, were the focus of this development project that was basically a pilot project for UNRWA's attempt to basically bring urban development to the camps. And with regard to the notion of a move away from encampment, I think you're seeing that with UNRWA as well in relation to Palestinian refugees. The idea, part of this effort is actually to, part of this urbanization effort of the camp is also to sort of make it so that the camp is much more connected to its surroundings. And also notions of self-reliance are very much present now in UNRWA discourse. So I think UNHCR is definitely, those policies are also having an effect on UNRWA, and which is also applying it to, or was applying it to Palestinians in Syria. Out of this pilot project has now emerged a program, basically infrastructure and camp improvement program, that is, again, basically about approaching Palestinian refugee camps through an urban development approach, and it has been used in other camps in Jordan, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, for example. And I think the reason Syria kind of served at the pilot about 10 years ago for this approach was that it was such a stable place. So there was housing infrastructure, roads were paved, the Aleppo bus system was brought all the way into the camp. That wasn't the case before. A water tower was built to extend water distribution to the entirety of the camp. Another camp, Nadab, also in the Aleppo area, initially was made up of these World War II, these barracks, army barracks left over from World War II, and you can still see some of them, the zinc-covered barracks. It's become a very sort of cramped living space, and so as part of this development project, also there was a housing aspect to it, but also here you have a youth skills training project. So again, this notion of self-reliance. Okay, so today UNRWA has reverted back to a focus on emergency aid consisting of services such as food assistance, cash assistance, health services, non-food assistance such as blankets and mattresses. It's also providing emergency shelter for about 9,000 internally displaced Palestinians. And at the same time, in parts of Syria that are sort of relatively stable, and usually it's parts that are firmly under regime control, it's actually continued some of its pre-war developmental assistance. So it's maintained its microfinance and loan programs in some parts of the country that are sort of relatively stable. And it's also continuing to provide education to about 43,000 Palestinians in Syria, as well as Palestinians who've been displaced from Syria to Jordan and Lebanon. And then finally, it's also involved in some degree of advocacy with regard to the legal protection of Palestinians affected by the war. UNRWA now has an official protection mandate. There's not much it can do except plead with states, and so it's not particularly effective, but it is involved in that as well. So now, just want to go over the situation of Palestinians who fled Syria. Most of them are in Lebanon. There are about 42,000 in Lebanon, Jordan about 17,000, 4,000 in Egypt, and significant numbers in Turkey and increasingly Europe. It's kind of hard to come by exact numbers for Turkey and Europe because for a lot of those heading to Turkey, Turkey is a transit point for going to Europe. So with regard to UNRWA statistics, what they're saying now is that at least 50,000 Palestinians have fled to Turkey and Europe. On the other hand, the Action Group for Palestinians in Syria claims that there are about 68,000 Palestinians in Turkey, and about 71,000, according to them, are now in Europe. So now just a brief country-by-country overview. Early on in the war, in January 2013, the Jordanian government announced a non-entry policy for Palestinian refugees. So very early on, they basically closed their borders to Palestinians. And so since that policy has been adopted, Palestinians who have tried to get to Jordan have had to do so through basically relying on smugglers. Once they're in the country, they're under threat of deportation, and Jordan has carried out some deportations. They're also not allowed to integrate camps that have been set aside for Syrians, except for Cyber City, which is more of a detention center with very little mobility. With regard to Lebanon, initially it was relatively easy for Palestinians to cross into Lebanon, and then Lebanon has been progressively tightening its borders towards Syrians as well. But by May 2014, basically, Lebanon effectively closed its borders to Palestinians. And around that same time, it also placed restrictions on the ability of Palestinians already from Syria or on its territory to renew their residency paper. And so I think last I checked, I think maybe about 80-something% of Palestinians from Syria now in Lebanon have expired residency documents. And so again, basically living under threat of arrest or possible deportation. And then that hasn't really happened en masse, but you're basically living, it's a very precarious, insecure living situation. There's also another problem related to that, is that there's a whole generation of Palestinian babies, Palestinians who were born in Lebanon, who are not being declared, not being registered because parents are afraid, because they're not in a regular situation. Okay, so contrary to Jordan and Lebanon, Egypt is not part of UNRWA's area of operation. And so because UNRWA doesn't officially operate in Egypt, normally Palestinians who fled to Egypt should come under the mandate of UNHCR. However, the Egyptian government has basically opposed that, and so has basically forbidden UNHCR to assist Palestinian refugees. I'm not sure they've officially explained why. UNRWA employees I've talked to seem to think it has to do with this kind of links back to the 48 war and this notion that if Palestinians are integrated within UNHCR, then it leaves Israel off the hook. So anyway, so basically there is no official organization assisting Palestinians in Egypt. UNRWA, however, has been, they've opened sort of a liaison office in Egypt, and they've been kind of advocating. And so I think through their efforts, there are some UN agencies on the ground, like I think the World Food Program and others, who are assisting Syrians, and they've been able to sort of figure out a way for those agencies to also help Palestinians in Egypt a little bit. So the Turkish government, sort of reportedly, and again, I think Maurizio's talk kind of showed this, you sort of have a progressive tightening of borders, but for a long time, Turkey was sort of characterized as having this sort of open door policy and, not engaging in refoulement, for example, and also allowing unlimited duration of stay. That's been the case for a while, more or less, but increasingly you have reports of refugees, both Syrian and Palestinians, being shot at the border, being pushed back. And now, very recently, you have also reports about deportation of refugees trying to cross the border. And again, with Turkey, Turkey's not part of UNRWA's area of operation. So again, Palestinians in Turkey should fall under the mandate of UNHCR, but UNHCR doesn't have a presence in Turkey. It does provide aid, but the aid is distributed through the Turkish government. And it appears that that aid is not reaching Palestinians. Part of it has to do, I think, with the fact that contrary to Syrians, Palestinians need a visa to go to Turkey. So those who have crossed into Turkey have done so again through smugglers, and so they're there in an irregular situation, and they've just been, I don't know if it's purposeful or not, but kind of invisible to Turkish authorities. And Palestinians that I interviewed in southern Turkey in the towns of Gaziantep and Kilis basically claimed that they weren't receiving any kind of assistance from the Turkish government or any kind of sort of international organization. They also claim that they're not allowed to integrate camps that have been set up for Syrians. Apparently, some have been able to, but it's because in the beginning, the Turkish government assumed that it was all Syrians. And then once they realized that there were Palestinians, they've apparently stopped or prevented Palestinians from integrating the camps. Let's see. So given the harsh realities affecting Palestinian refugees in Syria and neighboring countries, an increasing number of them are continuing on to Europe. And this is just a map of kind of the latest route, I guess, to Europe and specifically to Germany that is taken by many of the refugees from Syria. Since similarly to their Syrian counterparts, it is impossible for Palestinians to get visas to Europe from one of the Middle Eastern host countries, their only option is to go clandestinely. And these journeys are filled with uncertainty and danger. Accounts of these journeys highlight the danger of being abandoned by smugglers before reaching one's destination, of being cheated out of one's money by smugglers without making it to Europe, being shot at, arrested, or detained by authorities at the point of departure. A lot of reports, Egypt, for example, there's a lot of reports of Egypt engaging in that kind of behavior. Being arrested and detained along the way, countries like Greece, Hungary, Malta, for example. And as has been very publicized in the media, drowning during the crossing of the Mediterranean. Female migrants face additional dangers. A report by Amnesty International released this January notes that female refugees from Syria and Iraq face violence, assault, exploitation, and sexual harassment at every stage of their journey, including on European soil, from smugglers, security staff, and other refugees. Since September 2015, the clandestine voyage to Europe from the Middle East has become a little less dangerous and costly, even if it remains risky and harrowing experience. When photos of 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi lying face down on a Turkish beach after an unsuccessful attempt to cross over into Greece with his family were circulated on the international media, an outpouring of sympathy within Europe towards refugees followed. Germany soon announced an open-door policy toward refugees from Syria and others fleeing war and violence. And so this basically meant that once the refugees really had to rely on smugglers from Syria all the way to Greece. But once they reached Greece, usually authorities would just kind of move them forward towards Germany. And so the prices also have kind of decreased. When I was doing interviews in spring 2015, usually the journey, if you're going to go through Turkey, then by boat, and then mostly by foot, and maybe some transportation, people were talking about $5,000 to $7,000. And I think now, if you're leaving from northern Syria, the numbers I've heard are closer to $2,000. Now, that sympathy now seems to be evaporating, and anti-refugee and anti-migrant sentiment peaked in the wake of the November 13 Paris attacks, in which one of the ISIS attackers was believed to have reached France by posing as a refugee, and also increasing media reports, filled with news about migrants being involved in active petty crime or in the sexual harassment of European women. So having largely failed to persuade Turkey to stem the flow of migrants to Europe, basically in exchange for financial assistance, most European countries are apparently coalescing around a European Union proposal that would effectively turn Greece into a giant processing center for migrants. As part of this proposal, the EU is discussing the option of expelling Greece from the EU's passport-free travel zone and allowing EU member states to suspend the Schengen Agreement, basically the sort of borderless free movement within the EU, for up to 2 years. And actually Germany, Hungary, Sweden and Austria have already taken steps in that direction by recently reinstating temporary border controls. Another plan, which is endorsed by Jean-Pierre Juncker, the president of the European Commission, is to send an EU police force to the border between Greece and Macedonia. I think Maurizio talked about that, to create a buffer zone between Greece and the rest of Europe. And the reason Macedonia is being considered is because it's not part of the EU. Also, as part of these recent discussions, apparently Belgium's minister to the EU proposed building a refugee camp able to hold about 300,000 in Greece. So this is sort of a brief overview of the situation, very brief, overview of the situation in Syria and also outside. When examining the response to the human tragedy unfolding in Syria with respect to the country's Palestinian population, the media, as well as academic scrutiny, have largely focused on the actions of official actors such as Syrian government, Arab host states, European countries to which Palestinians from Syria fled, major humanitarian organizations such as UNRWA, as well as powerful unofficial groups such as the rebels. In the rest of this presentation, I would like to focus on the response of Palestinian refugees from Syria to their own predicament. The examples I detail here are based on approximately 40 interviews I conducted in spring and summer 2015 with Palestinians from Syria who were living in Lebanon, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, France, Sweden, and the United States. The overwhelming majority of them having fled to those places as a result of the war. My interviews are filled with examples that range from acts of care and compassion located in more or less intimate realms to more organized forms of public activism. A theme that appeared often in the interviews was parents trying to protect their adult sons from being drafted into the Syrian army through the country's compulsory military service, which applies to Syrians and Palestinians, or from being arbitrarily arrested at regime or rebel checkpoints because basically they're men of fighting age. I heard about parents confining their adult or sometimes teenage sons to the house for months at a time out of fear of them getting arrested or targeted by various warring factions at checkpoints. And then this would eventually become untenable, and so parents would stay behind, pool resources to enable their adult son to flee Syria. In one case, an eldest son was accompanied by his mother and younger brother, still a child, on his way from Damascus to Beirut as a protective mechanism, since he would draw less attention and suspicion by traveling as part of a family than if he were traveling alone. There were several examples of Palestinians in the Gulf countries supporting family members in Syria, or those who had fled to neighboring countries such as Jordan and Lebanon, where there's little opportunity to make a living. Some of the Palestinians I interviewed in the UAE mentioned supporting family members who were still in Syria, including the widows and children of male family members who had died or disappeared. Palestinians I interviewed in Europe who had crossed the Mediterranean told me about singing cheerful songs on the dingy boats or inflatable rafts during the crossing, partly as a psychological device to calm their own nerves, but especially so that the children would not feel afraid, so that they would think they were simply going on a fun outing. Female interviewees who made the crossing alone told me about being sexually harassed by smugglers, but also about how fellow male migrants, in this particular case, fellow Syrian and Palestinian travelers, looked out for them and attempted to protect them. In the rest of this presentation, I exit the realm of the intimate to that of public and organized social and political activism. I focus on Palestinian responses to the siege, destruction, and depopulation of Yarmouk. So before the war, and I'm not sure this is something that sort of at least people outside of the Middle East realize, but before the war, Yarmouk was exceptional in the way that it combined socioeconomic integration into Damascus, as well as its status as a commercial center with an enduring identity as a refugee camp known for its political activism around the Palestinian cause. It also counted many grassroots social organizations. Before it was, and here's another picture of Sharia Yarmouk, the sort of the main street going through the camp. Before it was infiltrated by rebels in December 2012, Yarmouk had turned into a refuge for Syrians fleeing neighboring areas that had become engulfed in the fighting. Yarmouk's inhabitants welcomed displaced Syrians, housing them in schools and mosques, and providing them with food, blankets, and other kinds of assistance. One interviewer explained the zeal with which Yarmouk's Palestinian residents welcomed internally displaced Syrians as a way of paying Syrians back for their hospitality towards Palestinians. However, Yarmouk's fate took a turn for the worst on December 16, 2012. This day is remembered by interviewees as Darabat al-Mig, the day when the Syrian army bombed the camp using Soviet MiG fighter jets. The bombs hit several schools, a hospital, and the camp's Abdel Qadir al-Husseini mosque, which you see in the background here, and killed at least 25 civilians. Mass flight out of Yarmouk began after these bombings, which also served as an excuse for Syrian rebels to infiltrate the camp, drawing Yarmouk into the war. In July 2013, Yarmouk was sealed off from Damascus by a government-imposed siege. By that time, only 20,000 of the camp's pre-war population of 150,000 remained. Yarmouk was no longer a safe haven for Syrian refugees, and local efforts turned toward the camp's remaining inhabitants. Several pre-war social organizations, and many of them tied either directly or indirectly to various Palestinian political factions, sprung into action, distributing food, collecting waste, and providing clean water to residents. Some of them include the Palestine Foundation, affiliated with Hamas, the Islamic Jihad Social Branch, and organizations such as Jafra, which was a youth center in the camp before the war. And after the war, those Jafra members were displaced. Some of them ended up in Lebanon, and now Jafra has become this NGO that is involved in humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Syria, and also until recently to Yarmouk. And part of its membership is still, or was still, at least until recently, trapped in the camp. Also, you had individual residents getting involved, documenting abuses committed by different sides of the war, also volunteering the camp's functioning hospitals or in its alternative schools. So I'd like to end this presentation by taking a closer look at these schools, which have received some amount of publicity in the Arab press, but no publicity in the Western press. So Al Jazeera, for example, has an article on them. In December 2012, UNRWA suspended its services, including its primary education program in Yarmouk, after the camp descended into violence. With the tightening of the siege in July 2013, formal secondary education provided by the government also came to an end. Several alternative schools were set up by camp residents, and at least some of them are still operating. I interviewed Abu Samah, the founder of one of these schools, in the Turkish town of Gaziantep in April 2015. He had fled to Gaziantep from Yarmouk about 10 months earlier. Abu Samah is an Arabic language teacher by training who worked in a government high school and at the Damascus University before the war. After Yarmouk became embroiled in the war in December 2012, he decided, along with his wife and nephew, who are also teachers, to hold classes at home for their own children and a few others, primarily to make sure they wouldn't lose their basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. As the students who joined the classes grew, they started looking for a bigger space. They began holding classes in the basement of buildings in the camp, basically to shelter themselves from shelling. They got desks and chairs from abandoned UNRWA schools. People in the camp who witnessed their efforts started offering to help. They donated pencils and notebooks. Former residents who had fled the camp also heard about these efforts and wanted to contribute. Abu Samah and his partners received calls from bookstore owners in the camp who gave them permission to break into their stores and take the school supplies that they needed. Pretty soon, the goal shifted from maintaining basic skills to providing full-fledged schooling. 3 schools were established, serving grades 1 through 9 and hosting 5,000 students. The classes were taught by volunteers from the camp. With most of the educated residents in the camp having fled, the majority of these volunteers only had high school diploma, but Abu Samah gave them additional training. The school started getting media attention, especially for operating despite the regular fighting and shelling affecting the camp, resulting in civilian casualties. In Madrasa al-Zahra, the school run by Abu Samah, 7 students died either in the school or on their way to school as a result of shelling. The attention the alternative schools were getting in the media prompted UNRWA officials to reach out, all the while explaining that they could not officially offer help because officially their services were suspended in Yarmouk. We told them we do not want financial support. All we want is that you recognize these schools and recognize the students and their results, Abu Sama explained. This demand was fulfilled. UNRWA recognized the alternative schools as legitimate, meaning UNRWA would recognize their programs, degrees, and report cards. Later on, UNRWA would play a crucial role, along with the Palestinian Authority, in negotiating with Syrian authorities to allow students from Yarmouk's alternative schools who had to take national exams in Damascus in order to graduate to be able to exit the camp during the exam period. In October 2013, the beginning of what Abu Samah describes as the period of hunger, Fitrat al-Jua, the camp lost its first hunger martyr, a baby girl named Majd. This period was a time when those who had the most food were eating 1 meal a day. Others were eating 1 meal every 2 or 3 days. Students started showing up to class tired and dizzy. Some of them were suffering from anemia and from diseases such as hepatitis and jaundice. Abu Samah and others running the schools were considering closing them, but parents intervened, begging them not to, because at least when the children were at school, it took their mind off the hunger. So the school stayed open, but the curriculum was adjusted so that only half of the school day was spent on core subjects, and the other half was spent on artistic and childhood development activities. In January 2014, UNRWA was able to make its first food delivery since the siege has started and was able to continue with intermittent food distributions. By then, Abu Samah was facing growing harassment from Jabhat al-Nusra because his school mixed boys and girls, and also because he was teaching subjects like dancing and music. And so eventually, he was sort of facing death threats, and this is why eventually he fled the camp. He basically exited with his students who were on their way to Damascus to take an exam, and instead of returning to the camp, he fled to Turkey. Now, I'm almost done. In April 2015, the camp was invaded by ISIS. And since then, it's really hard to know what's happened exactly to the camp or what's happening inside. But Abu Samah's Madrasa al-Zahra apparently seems to still be functioning, even though he's not there. The latest post from the school's Facebook page dates from January 2016. This is an earlier picture, Abu Samah with some of the teachers and some of his students when he was still in Yarmouk. So I think I've kind of gone over my time, but basically what I want to point out is that in this time, as we watch what's unfolding in Syria, in addition to looking at what official actors are doing, I think it's really important to also realize the resourcefulness, resilience, and courage of those who are in Syria, the civilians in Syria, and their efforts in trying to alleviate the suffering that's been caused by the war. Thank you.